Hello and welcome to the Kenyon Review virtual reading series. My name is Elizabeth Dark. I'm Associate Director of Programs here at the Kenyon Review. And I come to you this afternoon from the Kenyon Review offices in Finn House in Kenyon College's campus in Gambier, Ohio. Wow, that was a mouthful. This afternoon, in connection with National Poetry Month and our traditionally on-campus Poem in Your Pocket Day festivities, we begin one of 2 days of virtual poetry readings for you. This afternoon, we are honored to be hosting a virtual reading with Molly McCully Brown and Susanna Nevison. And tomorrow, also at 4:30, we will be hosting Oliver de la Paz, and Ira Sukrungrung will be joining me for that. As always, we are grateful to all of you who are joining us for these events. And in a few moments, I will begin by introducing Molly, who will then introduce Susanna. They will share their work with us for about 20 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A time with both of them afterwards. You, as an audience member, are able to send a question or comment at any time during this reading using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I, as the host, will receive your questions, and when the time comes, I will ask them for you. We will likely not be able to get to all the questions, but we will get to as many as we can. You will note the chat feature is not operating for this event, nor can audience members be seen or heard. I will now direct you to our Kenyon Review website to show you where you could, if you wanted, purchase books by Molly or Susanna, or any other book for that matter, by anyone from our Kenyon Review reading series. Give me a moment to find it. Here we go. Dun, dun. Okay. Thank you for your patience. So, if you go to the kenyonreview.org and then to events and then down to reading series, you will come up on our reading series calendar where you see this is our reading today. Tomorrow is Oliver de la Paz. You can follow this link to register for that and join us for that. And then we have this KR Bookshop up here, where if you click on that, it will take you to this page. And you'll see we have the book that Molly and Susanna have done together here. Then we have 2 books of Molly's and a book of Susanna's, followed by other books by people who have read or will be reading in our virtual reading series. So that is there for you at all times, not just during this reading or after this reading. It's there all the time. And I'm sure that they would welcome the purchase of their books. Okay. Am I back on the screen now?
You are.
Okay, for me. Thank you for confirming that. I now get to introduce Molly. When you first meet Molly McCully Brown, at least in my experience, you get past formalities within 2 sentences and suddenly you're telling her your entire life story. Not really the timeline of it, but the heartline of it. And you keep going because she is listening so actively. That's kind of what she's doing all the time. There is no passive anything in Molly, neither in her writing nor in her life. There is an urgency in her voice as a writer. And as a person, any room she's in, any space she enters, she does not just sit back. She shows up and she engages. Last fall, during Molly's first semester here as Kenyon Review's Poetry Fellow, my colleague Dan Laskin wrote, "The first thing that strikes you about Molly McCully Brown is her eloquent energy. The words come fast, sculpting ideas, earnest, playful, complex, speculative thoughts, wholly formed or tweaked in mid-air as if propelled by a kind of verbal joy." And Kenyon Review's editor, David Lynn, sums her up well in one word: fearless. Molly McCully Brown is the author of the poetry collection, The Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feebleminded, put out by Persea Books, which won the 2016 Lexi Rudnitsky First Book Prize and was named a New York Times Critics' Top Book of 2017. She also has a brand new essay collection titled Places I've Taken My Body, and she has a brand new poetry collection, which she has co-authored with her friend and fellow poet, Susanna Nevison. This collaborative project is called In the Field Between Us. both of these books, the collection of essays and this collaborative project, are put out by Persea Books, excuse me. And the title, In the Field Between Us, is ironic, as I have learned from Molly and Susanna that during this period of shelter in place, there is literally only a field between the homes where they are currently residing. Brown has been the recipient of the Amy Lowell Poetry Traveling Scholarship, a United States Artists Fellowship, a Civitella Ranieri Foundation Fellowship, and the Jeff Baskin Writers Fellowship from the Oxford American Magazine. Her poems and essays have appeared or are forthcoming in the Paris Review, Tin House, Crazyhorse, the New York Times, Pleiades, the Yale Review, Blackbird, and elsewhere. But I'm very happy to report that her first poem was published here in the pages of the Kenyon Review when she was 16 and won our Patricia Grodd Poetry Prize. I welcome Molly McCully Brown.
Liz, thank you. That was such a wonderful introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be doing this reading here for lots of reasons. It's a kind of strange circumstance because I know that there are many of you here and I can't see any of you. So it feels a little bit like I'm just talking to Susanna, which is actually in some ways the most appropriate possible setup for this book. There are a lot of drawbacks to the fact that these readings have had to move to a virtual space, but one great one is that I see that there are people here from all over and from so many parts of our lives, and that's a huge gift. And it's a huge gift to be the Kenyon Review Fellow and to be able to be here and read to all of you today. But the biggest gift is that I get to introduce Susanna Nevison. And I should tell you all that when we were talking about the fact that I was going to do this introduction a few minutes ago, Susanna described it a little bit like being introduced by her mom because in addition to being an incredible poet, she's one of my closest friends. But the thing really for you to know is that long before I knew and loved Susanna, I knew and loved her work and admired her deeply. I bought her first book at a writers conference the year that it came out, I think actually the month that it came out, and immediately began to read it in the middle of the conference room floor and took it up to my hotel room and skipped out on the rest of the day's events so that I could read it and annoyed everyone around me by making them listen to me read poem after poem out loud. Susanna's poems are expansive and inventive. They're smart in a way that is always generous rather than exclusionary. And they're so aware of the ways in which the strange and the ordinary live not just alongside each other, but on top of one another. Her writing is some of my favorite in the world. Her brain is one of my favorites in the world. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about her bio so you can get a sense of just how accomplished she is. Susanna Nevison is the author of Lethal Theater, Ohio State University Press, 2019, and the recipient of the Charles B. Wheeler Prize from OSU in the Journal. She's also the author of Teratology, which was the recipient of the 2014 Lexi Rudnitsky First Book Prize. And with me, she is the author of In the Field Between Us, a collaborative collection. Her honors include a fellowship from the Civitella Ranieri Foundation, the 2014 Patricia Aucus Prize from the Southern Indiana Review, the 2013 American Literary Review Poetry Prize, an Academy of American Poets, Larry Levis Prize, and recent Pushcart Prize nominations in both poetry and nonfiction. Her poems and essays have appeared in Tin House, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Crazyhorse, Pleiades, and elsewhere. She holds degrees from the University of Southern California, Columbia University, and the University of Utah. She's an assistant professor of English and creative writing at Sweetbriar College. Thanks for being here to do this with me, Suze.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Kenyon Review. Thank you, Elizabeth. It's an absolute honor to be here and to read with one of my favorite people and also one of my favorite poets. It is strange to be doing this online, but I also find it really delightful because people who would never otherwise be able to come hear us read or come to a reading at all are here, I hope. And I think that's really joyous. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here and read for you.
So as Susanna said, we're going to read to you today from our collaborative collection, which is called In the Field Between Us. And there are a few things that you should know about this book. It is a series of letters between two disabled speakers that traces a kind of search for belonging and an attempt to make their own universe in the aftermath of lifelong medical intervention. Susanna and I met all like 4.5 years ago now at a writers' conference. And from the moment that we met, we found ourselves talking about what it meant to be people and poets who lived in bodies that had been sort of products of surgical intervention for as long as we could remember. And because I already knew and admired Susanna's work, we started exchanging work very quickly and started joking about writing a book together probably within the first week that we had known each other. And eventually that joke turned into something that we were more and more serious about. The project really began because we were both at points with other projects where we didn't want to work on them anymore and we're trying to avoid them. And so we began writing poems as letters to one another back and forth in our inbox. And essentially what we wanted to see is if we could, from a distance, write a book that connected us, and if we could write a book in which we spoke only in the language that we shared, which was this language of medical intervention, of disability, of surgery and pain, and recovery, and if those poems would have meaning not only to us, but to readers. And it was a great pleasure to eventually realize that they did, and that we could in fact build a whole universe out of these letters to one another. So we're gonna read first from a set of poems that make up the bulk of the poems in the book, which are letters back and forth between us. And we're gonna read from a section of the book, which is kind of right in the middle, and it's called Operating Room. And then we'll pause and we'll read one set of the other kinds of poems in the book, and Susanna will tell you a little bit more about that.
All right. All right, let's get started. It's very awkward in my striped chair. Dear M, today I forgot I was looking for my own face, the shape of something I should love. I watched the leaves gather around my feet, their small dead selves lighter now, unselved. Perhaps this is part of it. This willingness to forget the way the world has touched our bodies sharply, so we refill ourselves with someone else. Someone who doesn't start every time she hears a distant saw, who doesn't feel her legs as deadwood, rot. I want to be the kind of woman who has one good story, and it's a good one, and it starts like this. Once I was in the dark woods. Here's the version I know instead. Nothing ever happens once. The woods are everywhere. The woods are rife with men and saws and knives. The trees once were alive.
Dear S, today I started walking where the trees were alive, still stitched to their leaves, still humming, still houses for musky, warm, and wild things who outbreathed all the men and all their knives. And yes, the woods were dark, but nothing ever happens once, and so they didn't stay that way. The sun came up on the survivors, and there I was, somehow among their number, still dragging the same legs, still finding buckshot caught behind my tendons, braced for new machines I might hear readying to work on all my flesh. It turns out we can last a long time with our legs bent, make it for miles crawling on our hands. A callus forms, we grow a shell. In curling downward, it is easier to press our ears right to the ground. Hear that beneath us both, where leaves and marrow wear down and wear out, there's water running. The woods once were something else.
Dear M, would you say that once the trees were bedded down, the seeds of them, like us, caught in the dark, that they broke themselves open to know what lurked inside, if they could last, if they could turn in time to press against the earth? Would you say that birth is the first hard frost we somehow just survive? And that, like us, the trees learn spring isn't fast or kind, but another way the world takes stock of what's allowed to stay. A crowd of green masks above our faces closes in like trees. What happens next is never ours to say.
Dear S, if the trees know birth is just another word for loss, that there's a cost to shifting from seed to sapling, all the shards of what you were that don't outlast the passage into light, the way the weather breaks across your back just when you learn its shape, slits and scars the wood, how if you list in one direction, there's a whole side of the forest you'll never see. Then, God, I love it that they do it anyway. Become themselves and stand there each spring as it batters them to blooming. Asks, what would you weather just to call yourself alive?
Dear M, our faces are beyond recognition. There are so many ways I've failed to see myself in the world, failed to see the world in me, though I folded the woods and the river into my arms, my chest, so that I might be wrecked again, so that I might be made into another thing the world forgets. I don't think we'll ever recognize a place as ours, as built for us, unless it's one we make from the ashes of the next best thing, a nest that's shaped by all the birds before us. Even the raft wasn't made for us, but of us, our bodies unable to carry themselves, but made to carry everything else. When I open my hands, I'm never surprised by the birds they turn into, how quick they are to take a thing apart to see what holds it up. Take a little string, some gauze, a piece of bark. Whatever it is we carry into each clearing, let's hold it up and squint until it turns into a face we know, a house we've loved, a wrecked and empty nest, a place the birds made for someone else, then left.
Dear S, the birds our hands become are the ones with holes cut in their cores, so you can see right through them to the world they're leaving toward. Little globe of cloud or rusted brush or green held steady there between their bones while they go on building and unbuilding their homes from what was there already, unspooling the string and tearing through the air like they are not torn through, like what's a wound was always meant to be a window. I open my hands and watch them work until they're out of sight. In one clearing, we settle down for a night with what the birds have left behind. In another, our hands make an aperture somebody sees the sky through.
Dear M, if what's a wound was always meant to be a woe, then say my body's shot with light. Say it's me who looks, who presses herself against the glassless frame and waits for the riddled surfaces to announce each version of the body I've been and the ones I think I'll become. My mother's perfect face that mine doesn't resemble. The idea of a child I can't see, and so imagine I might keep. Say it's me who does the mapping. I name the river and every gnarled tree, the places that they reach. Say I see the whole of me blanched dry and white. Say home is a shard of bone I pull from the riverbed, and say it's me who cracks the earth to put it back. The map is wrong. Someone else shoots me through with light, an X-ray, a map I'm told is clear and true. Someone else cracks me open too, names the earth, says what shard comes out, what each becomes, which piece goes back.
Dear S, at the bottom of the riverbed, the ground is dry as all the shards of bone we buried and unburied there. I puzzle skeletons together from the bleached scraps we wrenched loose, trying to make an animal of what they left us with when it was over. I know I'm glowing from the artificial stars they pumped us bright with, that the rivers in my wrists are running violet before they calcify. I'm leaking light. I stain the things I touch. I lie down in what is just a canyon now, and watching from above, they use my growing constellations to map out the world they've made. Pin down the north, my waning water, what's worth saving, how a good war spreads.
Dear M, what we leave down in the canyon, the stain of us, red on red, hemoglobin on hematite, the trace of us, the one true map we'll ever leave. Hidden out of sight, a place only forgotten animals tread. We're pinned to slabs and outline and sketch. The idea of us, a puzzle no one's yet seen or read. Loosed by bodies and their weight, we start again. We take another shape. We learn our worth by learning what we're not, like new animals or children who, finding themselves wingless, still test the air and fall.
Dear us, look, there our dead and heavy elements are piled high beside the silhouette of what we were before. Look, there our prior selves hush out like matches once they've lit the pyre. The light climbs high, too far away from anybody's home to be a flare. Look, let's watch until the whole of it cools first to smoke, then goes. I think we will be suited for it, being legless, weightless, wingless, leaping off.
Okay. At this point, we're going to switch modes a little bit, and we're going to read a sequence of poems from the book that are also letters, but they're not addressed to each other, between the two speakers. They're addressed to a maker figure. So much of this book is a working backwards to a version of a self that doesn't exist, is working backwards toward the self prior to surgical intervention. And one of the questions that kept coming up again, or continues to come up again and again in my life and in Molly's life and in our conversations, is what does that original self look like if you can never go back to it or ever know it? And so the only conversation that we could really have about that wouldn't be with each other, but would be with whoever made us. And for some folks, that's God. For some folks, that's simply evolution and science, biology. And so we wrote a series of poems addressed to a maker figure. Of course, maker is also for a poet, right? So philosophically, we hope that these poems sort of gesture towards something beyond just the two of us, towards the forces that are at work, that brought us here, that brought us into the world, that allowed us to live in the bodies that we lived before they were changed and also after. So I'm going to begin reading, if I can find it, with reading some maker poems. Dear Maker, my body keeps happening despite my insistence otherwise, so I repeat myself. I'll tell you how. I start at the beginning, then end at the beginning. You were there in all this, or are there. My mother who carries me until winter is there, was there, and it is cold when I arrive. And the fact of me was small, and I arrive again at the beginning, and there we are, and here it keeps happening. And when my mother looks at me, I'm sure I happen differently. Each time I arrive is a body keeps.
Dear Maker, it snows in this strange city. I'm bewildered by the white, the way it makes one perfect creature of the place, one body built up soundless overnight, then blown to pieces by the wind and how I barrel into it. my body as unsubtle here as anywhere. I distrust the weather in my body. There's a sudden, shallow warmth before tornadoes whistle damage down. Before my body had these seams, there had to be a shattering I don't remember. You'd have had to turn your face away from all the shards.
Dear Maker, I'd say the problem isn't the story, or that I'm in it, or that I resist the ways I'm drawn. It's always been gravity and matter and the planet's relentless pull. I resent the game. I don't want a seat at a table. I don't want a table either if it means everything here is pinned down by its own weight. I'd say the problem is I haven't been sold on the ground beneath me. Nobody told me the view is much better from space. When the planet becomes just another raised fist in the distance, I don't mind. Though I'm poorly drawn, I still raise mine.
And this is the last poem that we'll read for you tonight before we take some questions. Dear Maker, listen, if I can't know what you first whittled me out of, I would like to see the knife. The quick groove in an upper lip is called a philtrum. Like a blade slipped once, caught just before the damage grew too large to make the best of it, to fill a body up with neat little canals and say, you meant to cut a river there. If I can't know my body before it was riven, show me your hands. Right now, there's just the ghost of how they turned around my body, wrenched the whole thing toward another north. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you both. I'm coming back, 1 second. Okay, here we are. I want to start by thanking you personally. That was the highlight of my day, probably week. And I want to read some of the things that have come in that aren't questions, but I want you to hear them. From Kimberly, beautiful poems, Malls and Susanna. Love you both. From Nellie in Columbus, who sent a picture of herself in a field of dandelions. Best possible place to listen to Molly and Susanna reading. What a gift. There was another one. Where did it go? Oh, here it is. You said you two started this project as you were stuck or avoiding other projects. Thank you for avoiding those other projects for a while and for following this project to its fruition. And some more are coming in. I'll save those for the end. But I'll start with a question from Stella.
Hi, Stella.
In Chicago. What insight from your experience writing this book together over distance might you offer as advice for connecting with others during this time apart?
You want to take a swing at that, Molly?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question.
I could say a couple. I'll stall, Molly.
Yeah. You stall while I think about things.
Okay.
Perfect.
I would say one of the actual interesting things about our relationship, my relationship with Molly, is that we've never actually lived in the same place at the same time ever. So that distance is actually a really normal part of our friendship and a normal part of our relationship. And I think one of the things I learned through writing this book and through my friendship with Molly is that distance doesn't have to mean lack of intimacy. Distance doesn't have to mean lack of knowing someone, doesn't have to mean isolation, right? And just because we haven't been in the same place doesn't mean I think I've felt far from Molly in a lot of ways. And I think this book, this writing, has brought us really close together. And maybe one of the things I would say is that during this time of isolation, that it's a good idea to write old-fashioned letters, maybe, and to reach out and to try to hold people close to you, even if you can't hold them in physically, if that makes sense. That was not an answer, but it was a very good attempt at stalling.
It was a great attempt at stalling. And the thing that I would say coming off of that is the thing that, felt so remarkable to me about this book, continues to feel so remarkable as I sort of continue to be amazed by the fact that it's a thing that we can hold, is that it's a thing that we constructed together. We built from nothingness. And I guess one of the things that I one of the pieces of advice that I would have for people in this time in terms of connecting across distance is if there's a way to make something with someone else from a distance, whether that is something that you're writing or whether it's like being engaged in trying to do the same puzzle, you know, far apart, or whatever it looks like, the process of building something that lasted and was tangible and sort of existed beyond us and apart from us with someone I loved, and with someone whose brain I admire so much, was really wonderful. And it made me feel like even beyond the kind of daily regular contact of our friendship, where we were texting each other to be like, you know, this crazy thing happened to me, or I had a weird dream, or hope your conversation with X, Y, and Z went okay. The fact that we were also constructing this thing, I think, did wonders for our friendship and felt like a really incredible product of a time that we were both flitting around a lot and going through difficult things, and we're very far apart.
That's a really smart answer.
I love the fact that you've always lived far apart, but during this time of quarantine, you live closer together than you've ever lived before.
No.
Yeah,
it's isolation for everyone else, and like Molly and I are practically in the same room. So just like the rest of our lives, we're having the opposite experience. Yeah,
yeah, I have everyone else all the time. That's right.
I love that. I love it. Tracy has a two-part question. She says, I'm sure I won't be the only one to ask this, but aside from using that shared language that you mentioned, what other parameters did you set up? Were there rules about the repetitions that happen sometimes in form or in line length?
No, we actually did not set up any parameters at all, except that they would be letters back and forth, and that we would have to take turns, and there was no skipping your turn, because some of us skip turns. It's like, cool, write 4 letters and I'll think about it. Like, no. I think the parameters, because we are both poets and because we were both used to constructing collections that harken back to earlier poems, right, where the same images and metaphors occur again and again, I think, at least for me, one of the things that became exciting as the collection unfolded is I didn't have to repeat myself. I could repeat Molly, and that felt really exciting. Yeah. And it felt like the language then that was once just individual became the shared language as the collection unfolded. But that just happened as we went. There was no real roadmap. When we edited, we went through, I think, and we're like, okay, we say that too much, or the word bone occurs 174 times, and we only need to occur 170. So, you know. Like
yeah, and I would say that, you know, one thing to know is that even before we sat down to write this book, Susanna and I were trading and editing one another's work with great regularity, and so we're trading poems that we were writing individually, and we're responding to one another's work, and we're reading one another's work, and I think because of that, and because we share, as we've sort of said again and again, this really profound experience of disability and medical intervention, and because we were in such regular touch, the way Susanna thinks as a writer and the way her poems move feels very familiar and very natural to me, and so I felt capable of responding to them without sort of more constraints imposed on them from the outside, because it felt like a voice that I was very comfortable inhabiting, and her work is work that I feel like I know. There's probably no one beyond myself, there's no one whose work I know as intimately or as well as I know Susanna's work.
Yeah, that's true.
And in some ways, the letters themselves became their own kind of constraint, because it was essentially like having a writing prompt show up in your inbox every week. And it was great. This kind of magical thing happens where you write one poem and then someone writes somehow the perfect poem to force you to think about the things that you said in the previous poem in a different or in a more detailed way. It's sort of like the weird inverse of those choose your own adventure novels, where you just sort of stop and then someone tells you what the next thing is. And it was really wonderful.
Well, tied to that, and this sort of, a number of people are asking a question similar to the one I'm about to ask, which is also from Tracy. What, if any way, did collaboration change something about the work you do outside of collaboration?
I don't want to do it. It made me think that work outside of collaboration is so much harder because you have to like be the architect and the builder and the materials. Like you have to do all of it, and that seems like a lot of work because it is. And the thing about collaboration, like I would say the thing that collaboration taught me is to sort of let go of that sense of control, right? That the best things are going to happen when you loosen the reins.
Yeah.
Because when you're collaborating, the most exciting things happened in this collection for me during writing because I was just playing. I was actually giving myself permission to have a nice time because we didn't think it was real for a long time, like it was going to be anything. And because I didn't have to try to picture where we were going because Molly would always give me the next piece of the puzzle, right? And so losing that control, which I think is very scary if you're doing a project on your own, was ultimately super joyous and fun and comforting here because I had Molly to lean on. And I think what I try to do in projects now is to make sure that I'm still building in that sense of wildness, that sense of loosening the reins, of loosening the roadmap, right? So that I don't end up forcing myself to go where I want to go, but I end up going where the work is telling me to go.
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe not true for everyone, but it's certainly true for me. Sort of once you've written and published your first book, and you know, like, oh, like I'm writing things to be read now. I'm writing things that I'm sort of envisioning immediately going into the world. It is possible to lose some sense of risk, but also just like a sense of unadulterated joy, because all of a sudden you're doing this thing that is your job and that has a lot of professional pressure associated with it, and it feels, you know, complicated and fraught. And the really great thing, as Susanna pointed out about this book, was that for a long time we really thought that maybe we were just doing a thing for ourselves because we enjoyed it and didn't want to do the jobs that we were supposed to be doing. And the thing that restored for me was just an absolute sense of joy. And that, like, I was like, oh yeah, I love writing. I love writing. It's wonderful, and magical and strange. And so the thing I think that has lasted from my experience with this collaboration, and that Susanna and I have continued to say to each other, is like, I want every project I do to feel like that, right? Like I want it to be born out of joy and out of a desire to do it and out of a sense of curiosity about what's going to come next. And obviously it's really easy to feel that sense of curiosity when someone else is producing the thing and you literally don't know what's going to come next. But I think it is possible to maintain that curiosity about your own work and about the sort of possibilities for the universes that you're imagining. And I feel like that's stuck in my head. And now in some ways it's the bar. If I'm doing something and it doesn't feel that wonderful, I'm like, yeah, who has time? Like, because it can feel that good, you know?
Did the collaboration end up helping with the projects that you were avoiding?
I mean, I don't, ultimately, I guess, I mean, I was sending my second book out for publication and it got published. So that's good. And I was able to revise it and do final book edits pretty much simultaneously as I wrote this book. And that maybe my eye for editing was sharper or better. I hope it was. If not, it's too late. And Molly was doing her essay collection, and I'll let her speak to that.
Yeah, and I think for Susanna, in some ways, that probably the biggest thing she got from it was just that she had a thing that could distract her in the sort of uncertainty of not knowing what's going to happen to a book that she'd written. But for me, yeah, I mean, I really think I think that writing this book of poems was really key. Yeah, I was at the time sort of making my way through beginning to write the essay collection that became Places I've Taken My Body, which comes out in a little bit. And
beautiful, beautiful book.
Thank you. And so that book did get done, and I think in some ways I don't really know which one is which, but they sort of feel like the A and B side of a record to me and an album. They're very much in conversation, and I think being able to have this conversation in Poems with Susannah and do this work that felt so natural and in which I felt like I had so much company absolutely made it possible to take on writing this essay collection, which was a genre in which I felt much less comfortable, which was a project that required a level of kind of self-revelation that I was very unsure about, and which I sort of continually doubted the value of and the margins of, and in some ways seeing how meaningful it was to build this universe with Susannah and to talk about experiences with disability and with surgical intervention and with alienation and with pain in this way, I really think gave me the push that I needed to make my way through the essay collection. And I should also say that the other thing that is true and was happening is that Susannah read every single draft and every single essay that I wrote along the way.
So really, it was really fun. It was fun.
From Kea, I found the Maker poems especially beautiful and moving. Can you talk about the intersection between faith and disability?
Oh, this is a fun question for us. So yeah, Sus.
No, you go.
So this is these Maker poems were really interesting for us, particularly because I think we're both, as Susannah pointed out, really interested in and really attached to these sort of questions of origin and of what it means to not know your body as it originally came into the world and to only know it as this thing that has been constantly and continually revised. But Susannah is not a person who believes in God, and I am a person who does, and so that's an interesting sort of tension, I think, in the text. But it's also maybe, I think, some of what gives the poems their kind of urgency and strangeness and particularity, is that we had to have a really expansive sense of who that maker figure was, and of to whom we were writing. And so for me, I am sometimes thinking about a deity-like figure, a god-like figure who has some sort of knowledge and presence and control. But I'm also often thinking about the surgeons and the doctors who literally made me, and the collision between those things. And for me, that sort of collision and that tension is a lot of where the sort of resonance and urgency of faith comes up for me. And I think it's part of what makes those poems interesting. And I think for Susannah, trying to imagine, like, and I'll let her talk more about this, but like, how do you write to a maker figure who you don't maybe even necessarily like believe in or believe is a force, I think became really interesting. And we both at various times, I think, struggled with these poems in particular, but I wouldn't let Sus give up on them because I was invested and interested, and I'm really glad they made it into the book. I don't know if I have a ton to say about the relationship, like about sort of the like big relationship between faith and disability, because I feel like that's as different for any individual, like it's a deeply individual question. But I do certainly think that like questions of origin point and questions of our bodies as they are versus as they have been attempted to be made versus as they were originally feel really especially urgent to me, and that those feel like a lot of what gives urgency to my kind of relationship with faith.
Yeah, as Molly said, I really like resisted the Maker poems, in part because I am an atheist, and in part because I was so, when I'm writing a poem, an epistle to Molly, I know who the you is there, and imagining a you for this maker was like just so much more complicated and uncomfortable, right? Because it really pushed on what do I believe about where I came from? What do I believe about faith? What do I believe about myself as a spiritual person and the body and the soul? And that felt weird. But it was also a really productive thing for me, and a way to write a different kind of private address that let me still have those questions without having to answer them myself. Right? As if someone could write me back. That was the liberating part, right? That I could ask these questions finally to a surgeon or a God, if there is one, or the air, that I could articulate them, to me felt incredibly meaningful, right? And unlike the poems between me and Molly, there is no response. But the simple fact that I could articulate them and let them sit in the air felt really meaningful to me. And I think that's what faith is, right? It's an articulation of something and letting it sit in the space in front of you and often there is no response, but it's the articulation of it, right? The ritual, the recitation, the prayer, what have you.
Yeah.
And so for me in that way, they were incredibly meaningful.
Yeah.
And I think those poems serve a really interesting place in the book because unlike the epistles where because the addressee is clear, the author is therefore always clear, like it's clear which one of us produced them. The maker poems exist in this space that really does kind of erase the barriers between us, and it poses these questions from a kind of voice that is as much the book itself as it is either one of us individually, and that's kind of wonderful. And I think that the space for mystery that allows is also really lovely and was really moving to me as the collection came together to encounter the kind of the real blending of our voices and the kind of erasure of that boundary.
I'm gonna continue with that theme. Some more questions have come in related to this, and I'm actually dividing some people's comments and questions just to keep the subject going here. Frank comments, your poetry, individually and collectively, is imbued with such beauty and truth that even I, a person who does not believe in the divine, am forced to believe in grace. Thank you for bringing such astonishing work into this world.
Oh, that's really kind and lovely.
And Ms. Shirai, a KR fellow with Molly, asks, going off what you're just saying, I'm curious about this interesting difference between the two of you. One of you believes in God and one of you doesn't. How does this enrich your life beyond the writing life too?
I mean, in our relationship or in general, like what do I gain from not believing in God? Or I guess she can't answer. Okay, good. Then I'll just answer how I feel.
Can I be Misha for a second?
I would say, I'll answer it both ways. First of all, my mother was raised Catholic, and so Catholicism is a religion that sort of my family is like hovers over my family, and my husband's was also raised Catholic. So I was raised Unitarian, so we just, we believe in whatever we want, really, and that's also super liberating. For me, not believing in God is incredibly comforting because it means that whatever is happening will dissolve and go away, and there will be another chance for this all to begin again, right, in the natural world, and that everything is tied here in molecules. And that makes me really, I think, happy. I like that very much. And I also like it because I feel like I don't have to follow rules or like practice things other than obviously trying to be kind and not go to jail and all that stuff and believe in peace.
Those are good boundaries.
I believe in morality, and that's a different, I believe in ethics. But that they exist for their own sake. They exist to make you a better person so that you lead a more meaningful life, not that so you might go somewhere in the next life. And to me, that feels very rewarding. But I find it very hilarious that, of course, my best friend is also Catholic. My best friend growing up, whose birthday it is today, also Catholic, has this deep and meaningful relationship with God that I think is comforting to her in the way that my feeling that there isn't one is comforting to me. And I like being able to have those conversations with Molly. I like that we don't think about it the same way, and I like that both sets of belief have shaped our work in really fundamental ways. So even though I don't believe in God, it doesn't mean that I'm not thinking about the divine. It doesn't mean I'm not thinking about divinity or revelation or grace in my work. It just means I think about it in a different way, right? Or I call it a different thing. And Molly's always telling me that I'm secretly really religious, so I don't know.
Okay, that is not true. What I tell you is that you are the most scripturally interested atheist that I know, which is really true.
I love the Bible and love the Old Testament.
really loves the Bible, and her really incredible second book, Lethal Theater, is really imbued with a sort of relationship to the biblical. That's really fascinating. And it's funny to hear Susanna answer this question, because many of the things that feel comforting to her about not believing in God are hilariously the same things that feel kind of comforting to me about believing in God, which is this idea that it's all tied to something that goes back and back and back, and that there's a cycle that will start over, you know. So it's funny, and I think telling that even though we both sort of like we have different sort of destinations, our angles of approach are really linked and really similar, which seems right and unsurprising if you know us or have ever spoken to us. And like Susanna, I really appreciate being able to have these conversations with someone who is interested in thinking through this stuff, but thinks about it differently, and isn't attached to dogma, but is incredibly respectful of the things that are important to me. And it's really, it's wonderful to have the ability to kind of talk about this across what seems like a distance, but is actually like a real proximity.
This question comes from Liz, who's one of our Writers Workshop participants. And she asks, can you talk about the themes of vulnerability and control, and of resilience and becoming, and how they perhaps pertain to all of us at this moment?
Vulnerability and control, trust, was that one?
Resilience and becoming, I think, right? Yeah.
Vulnerability, control, resilience, becoming, in the now.
So I can talk a little bit about, I mean, I think that there are, one of the things that I think has been so wonderful for me about my friendship and my working relationship with Susanna that really made its way into the book is that that our friendship, and then the space of this text, is one of the very few spaces in the world where I feel comfortable being sort of totally vulnerable and totally open, and I think one thing that having a disability has sort of created in my life is this need to whether I want to be or not, I'm often vulnerable a lot of the time, because there are ways in which my body is particularly fragile. There are things that I can't do. There are ways in which I need help, and all of that stuff creates a kind of very present vulnerability. And I think I spent a lot of time in my life feeling like that was a thing that I needed to try to paper over as much as possible, or to ignore as much as possible, or to hide from other people as much as possible. And one of the things that our friendship has helped me do, and that writing this book helped me do, is sort of access vulnerability as a space that allows for connection, right? And that allows for surprise, and that allows for kind of magical interactions that wouldn't happen otherwise. And it seems to me in this particular moment in which, like, we're acutely aware, all of a sudden, everyone is sort of acutely aware of the ways in which we're all vulnerable, right? Being alive, being a human being is an acutely vulnerable state. And in which we have to, in some way, we all have to sort of be at a physical distance from one another in order to not harm each other because of that vulnerability. I think that being unafraid to be honest about that vulnerability with other people, and be clear about it, and do that. I mean, I think in some ways that's our only shot at anything like resilience, right? Is the ability to kind of wade through all of this in the open space where we all admit just how vulnerable we are, and just how difficult the thing that is to encounter. But there's real potential for connection there, and real potential to build something out of that vulnerability. And that was true for me in writing this book, and in believing, and kind of letting go and seeing what someone else would do with the text. And I think it's also true in this moment. I'm not sure I have any like super great advice to give, but that seems resonant.
When I think about sort of vulnerability or being open about suffering, I think it's important to remember that it's relative, right? Like my suffering is only something I can experience and articulate, and that is not bigger or smaller than anyone else's suffering, which is something they can only experience and or articulate. That we're all really, we're all in this together. We're all in this together. But that it's important to know that there's space for your own difficulty, for your own struggle during this time. I think there's a lot of rhetoric like, well, you should feel grateful because you're lucky and all that. And we should, if you're safe, I think that's true. But I also think it's okay for that to be difficult. And I think articulating the ways in which that's difficult gives other people permission to be vulnerable too. And I think that's really important. And I think hopefully that's something that we are learning how to do culturally at this moment in a way that we don't normally do. And I think that's a kind of new kind of, can we say, cultural vulnerability, or that we're maybe learning how to do. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Just talking to a screen, so.
Cam asks, has the process of writing from your own history of pain and medical body trauma been healing in any ways? And if it has, how so?
Here's what I'll say. It's been rewarding. I wouldn't say it's been healing, right? Because like there's the history of my body and the history of Molly's body and the ramifications of all of that. And I have a changing relationship to that day to day as my relationship to my own body changes day to day. But what it's done and what it continues to do is allow me to impose some sort of narrative structure, some sort of meaningful framework on something that I often struggle to find or articulate hopeful meaning within, right? And so it allows me to reframe my experience somewhat fictionally, right? Because it's a book of poems. Like obviously Molly and I did not get, there's a poem in here about getting stuck in a fence. We've not been stuck in a fence together, but we've been stuck in a fence metaphorically. It allows me to take the emotional experience that I don't really have anywhere else to put and build it in a space that has real parameters. And that's really rewarding because that's a thing I can touch and control, and ultimately a thing I can put down and walk away from in a way I can't with the real history of my body. And so I don't know if I find it healing, but I find it a nice supplement to the reality that I live in, that I can create another one. And I find it even more comforting and rewarding that I get to do that with Molly, with someone else who's asking the same questions, who deals with similar issues that we deal with. And to do it with someone else's brain keeping you company is really, really, really lovely.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think rewarding is a great phrase. I mean, one thing that felt especially so to me was this idea that one of the things Susanna and I spoke about really early on is the sense that like talking about disability and particularly in this way with this language that came so naturally to us was something that had always sort of happened on the margins. And one thing that the text is able to do, right, is it makes a universe where that's the center, right? Where that discussion is the center and that language is the dominant language. And there's something really wonderful about that, right? About being able to take this experience, which has sort of seemed like it's mostly happening on the edges, and move it to the kind of center stage. And so that has felt really rewarding to me. And then the other thing that is rewarding, which touches on what Susanna said, is that the writing the book took an experience that until that point was largely a source of isolation and largely a thing that I had experienced sort of singularly and not really articulated to very many people, and it turned it into a communal and a connective experience, and that is enormously rewarding. And it's even now been a step more rewarding because now the book that we wrote together that was already a communal and collective experience is starting to make its way into the world, and we're starting to watch other people respond to it and have a relationship to it, and so now it's even more a sort of source of connective tissue, and that has been, I think, the most profoundly rewarding thing of the experience for me.
There are, I think we have time for one question, and then I want to share with you all the comments that people are writing in just to kind of end this because it's been a high moment for many people. But I'm going to try to, a lot of them are about process of collaborating. So I'm just going to throw like a packet of questions to you.
Sounds good.
Kind of the same thing, and they sort of involve other people's questions. See how this goes. From Maddie, a KR associate, but then also from some other people too. I was wondering how you took your correspondence and turned it into this book. Are there sections more close to the original than others? How did you go about assembling and revising? Which ties to another person's question. Did you revise each other's work as you were going, or did you just accept the creator's revisions? And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. So it's just this process, like, you got it. Okay.
We wrote the book mostly in order. It's mostly in the order that it was written in, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. A couple of the poems, mostly mine, that were not good, then also meant we had to like take out, then we also had to take out the corresponding one. Sometimes I had to rewrite little pairs, but they were filling like a space in the manuscript at that point. And we didn't do that until the very end. In terms of revision, I think we both tinkered with our own poems as we went. And then we both edited all of our individual poems in the book. And then we both edited the entire manuscript. So we both edited each other's poems and the book as a whole together. And that's a real testament. And that, I think, for a lot of people would be really uncomfortable, being like, here are all my poems, tear them up. But ultimately, it was super fun because like the opportunities for revision were presented in the opposing poem. Like, oh, Molly's doing this cool thing in line 7. What if I change line 9 in the poem facing it to nod toward that? Will that make this book better? Right? Those kinds of things. And recognizing that for each other was super fun, I'd say. Molly, is that right?
Yeah, it's exactly right. And I mean, so two things. One thing is to know that, you know, we wrote these poems at a great distance from one another, but the writing process was punctuated by 2 or 3 times when one of us would go to visit the other one and we could be in the same place. And a lot of the work of revision was done in those moments of actually being together. And a lot of like, it was a very material thing. Like we would lay the poems out on the floor and someone's dog would step on them, but we would interact with it together as this thing that we'd put together, and we would have conversations. Like one of us would say like, oh, I hate that poem that I wrote, and the other one would say like, okay, fine, but then we have to take this corresponding poem out, and so we have to figure out what goes there, and that was a really sort of nice act of proximity after this distance thing. And then I would say that, like, yeah, the process of revision was really wonderful and really easy, largely because I trust Susanna and I trust her brain and her instincts so much. Like, the biggest piece of advice I have for anyone is, like, if you're going to collaborate, do it with someone you admire profoundly and who is more interesting and smarter than you, because they will make your
I bet the other one is more interesting and smart, back and forth, add and
because they will make your work more interesting. And so, and also again, because as I've said before, Susanna and I had a long history by that point of spending time with one another's work and of offering one another edits. I felt very comfortable just letting her like take a poem of mine and be like, I don't know about this line, and I wonder if we did X, Y, and Z. And conversely, I felt very comfortable saying like, this feels to me like a slower moment, and I'm wondering what happens if we move this to here, you know? And so the poems are singular in one sense because we did really write them individually and we didn't revise each other's as we were going, but the whole book became a very collaborative object by the time we reached the end.
Okay. There are more, but I can't get to them, so I'm just going to spill you with compliments now. Kathy Fagan in Columbus says, "You too rock. Thank you so much for these poems."
Thanks, Kathy.
Hi, Kathy.
Liz Johnson, Molly and Susanna are the best. Awesome reading. I can't wait to read the book. Misha, so happy to be there to hear Molly and Susanna read. I wish I could access the chat box to send some claps over. There are a lot of claps. Michael, who is another Writers' Workshop participant, says, "The honesty of the moments of the body in each of you in your writing is sterling and so appreciated." Buffy says, "Brava, ladies, I listened hopefully and I send love." So inspiring, love you too. Wonderful, brilliant, joyous. You're both brilliant, talented, and generally awesome. So good to see your faces and hear your work aloud. From David Lynn, truly amazing, beautiful, deeply moving reading. It's been a long time since I've been so engaged. Bravo and thank you on behalf of everyone.
Thanks, David.
Thank you. You all were fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, this was a real pleasure, real highlight. Thank you so much.